Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 28 transfer plans. But the first thing we'll do, of course, is structure the video in the sense that we're looking at a Game Week 27 team review and then actually discussing in terms of wider strategic point, just because I'm in a bit of a unique situation myself. I'm someone who, of course, wildcarded in Game Week 26, but I think I have two options now in terms of pivoting between free at 29 and pivoting between free at 34. So the way this video will be structured, will be discussing my strategy if I pursued a direction of free at 29, and then also a direction if I pursued free at 34. And the reason why I'm considering that is simply because with the amount of injuries that I have, I actually need to take hits now in game week 28, unfortunately, to create a good free at 34 team. Now that hit might actually be worth it. It might pay off when it comes down to, let's say, just the short term game week 28, 29. It might even pay off in terms of how I change between my 1 strategy, right? Game week 29 and game week 30 is interesting because a lot of people free hit on game week 29 won't have an additional transfer, whereas I myself will have that additional transfer. Although, of course, I think I will be taking hits on game week 29 if I pursue a free at 34 strategy. And that means that I can still go towards Salah because I would be bidding off Haaland game week 28, whereas some of the other people who might be keeping Haaland game week 28 might actually have to keep Haaland, when it comes to arriving at game week 30, because it's not very simple to just move with two transfers, for example, that you wouldn't have if you free hit to go towards Salah. So that's the key point there. In terms of my team, of course, just reviewing Game Week 27, though, it was very nice to have the differentials pay off in terms of Neto. However, my other two differentials in terms of Senesi and the other Neto did not pay off at all. We had two injuries this week, which is, about as bad as it can get in FPL. Tony as well, who's another differential, has continued to disappoint. The question about Tony, of course, is whether I persist with him. And of course, this is going to be a part of a wider strategic point later on. But he has been a bit dismaying. And I think his underlying stats as well this season have been really poor. We also have to say, of course, it is a small sample size. It is only 8 games played. Someone like Mbumo could be coming back to the team. So you could argue that that sort of boosts the offensive arsenal of the team. But in general, the performances haven't been too great. On the contrary, of course, you can see that there's still a lot of centre forwards within that team who are doing well. Mope has scored recently. Wisa has scored back-to-back in the last 2 games. As far as just talking about my injuries, though, I think the most concerning part about these injuries is that, yes, of course, I can take a hit now to replace Senesi, but does it make sense? Because I've got someone in Doughty in my team. If you look at my bench now, and when I'm looking at Game Week 28, if I have to field 3 defenders, I still want to just field simply Saliba, Gabriel, and Doughty and just call it a day there. My concern, of course, is that previously I would have had the value of Senesi with 2 amazing fixtures, and you can see, of course, Sheffield United at home, just how ridiculously poor they are as an offensive team, even as a defensive team. And it sucks, really. Like, this is just what happens in FPL sometimes. We go for players who are slightly differential. Of course, at one point, I was considering between Saliba, Neto versus Ait-Nouri and Odegaard. Now, of course, Odegaard has done amazing. Ait-Nouri killed it last week, and I'm standing here looking like an idiot. And that's sometimes what happens at FPL, and that's okay. We just have to overcome those issues. But the issues that have cropped up, obviously, is that I probably have to replace Neto. I need to listen to what Gary O'Neill says about him. It did seem like an impact injury, though, because when I was watching the Wolves game, and I was actually watching 3 games of football one time, I remember watching Brentford versus Chelsea, Newcastle versus Wolves, and even the Liverpool game at the same time. And Neto had a contact injury with an aerial duel at 45 minutes. The way Gary O'Neill explained it, though, in the press conference is that it didn't sound great. And of course, he needed to be taken off as a point of precaution. So we have to sort of see and listen to the press conference this week to see if Neto is fine, because that could change my plans a lot, right? Ultimately, if you look at my midfield now, Saka, Palmer, Son, Neto, and Fernandes, I mean, if these players play next week, I can actually keep this 5-man midfield. At the same time, though, we have someone like Bowen, if we pursue a different direction that we can go for, or I can just simply remove Tony from my team if I pursue free at 29 direction and just keep Haaland in the team. That could make a lot of sense too. And that's unfortunately the position that we're in. Senesi, we hope, will come back after the international break, because what Andoni Iraola said was that he could maybe make it towards the international break and play for Argentina for the first time. Or not the first time, rather, but actually, he's been just called back into the team. So, of course, he wants to play. But it also probably means and suggests that he could be back for Everton at home, which is a decent fixture all in all from a sort of Bournemouth defender here. At the same time, as I said, I've been quite dismayed with the Brentford picks as well. I mean, looking at Tony and Flecken, it's not great, right? But we do know as well that when we talk about Game Week 29, Flecken is still a very good pick. So that's sort of why we picked him, right? Just to be our Game Week 29 goalkeeper. And I'm glad that in the meantime, of course, Neto has delivered the goods, right? So next week, of course, we have Neto, and he should hopefully be quite good. This is basically as good as it gets when it comes to a double for a goalkeeper for a sort of team of Bournemouth's caliber. And yeah, I think it would make a lot of sense for anyone who's actually making transfer plans to invest into a Zabarni or Kirkes or even in Adam Smith. The biggest thing that people need to listen to within the press conferences is just updates over Lloyd Kelly, updates over Senesi, of course, just in case there's some sort of miracle comeback, which I think is super unlikely, but also just the Max Aaron's injury. Because, of course, if Max Aaron's continues to be out for the foreseeable future, then you have Adam Smith basically locked. Whereas some people have some more doubts over Kirkes, although I would argue that he's the more attacking Bournemouth left back, if just by watching football. As far as the midfielder, once again, the concern is over Neto. Not really too concerned with Son, Palmer, and Saka. I did mention that going for Palmer was a little bit of a sort of agnostic move. When I describe agnostic, it just means that I didn't really like the idea of going from Bruno to Maddison. And you can see why I didn't go for the Bruno to Maddison move. Ultimately, my team was quite fragile. I knew that Tony was not playable in Gameweek 28. And we're now looking at a team where if I had transferred Fernandes out, I would have Maddison for sure in place of Palmer, but actually I would be dealing with potentially two issues with my team, right? Because I'd be dealing with Neto now, I'd be dealing with Hwang, not to mention Senesi, who I technically don't have to deal with this week, fortunately, because I actually have 3 defenders, and of course Pau Torres seems to be back to full flight football, so that's a nice thing. But of course, you can see, of course, how that direction could have gone if I went for Bruno to Maddison, even though the points would have been exactly the same. Now that I have Bruno next week, it looks a lot better. So that's basically a team review for this week. Once again, going back to the Arsenal picks, I don't think there's any reason for me to take them out of my team, right? Because Senesi's injured. If I'm to make a transfer in Game Week 29 for someone like Pedro Porro is going to come in to replace Senesi. And that's about it, really, when it comes to my transfers. So that's an interesting position, right? The Arsenal players are locked in. Palmer's locked in. Haaland's an interesting one because I think, once again, it comes back down to the strategy choice that I go for. Watkins is, I think he's just brilliant. It's something that we talked about. Whenever you have the chance to face such good fixtures, even Spurs, of course, is going to be a good fixture. West Ham and Wolves, these are great fixtures. So the question about Watkins is whether we move away from someone like Watkins on Game Week 31 or whether we actually keep him, because he is, of course, arguably a season keeper. And the same thing can be said about someone like Saka, although we have to monitor, of course, the 45-minute substitution, although I think it's very clearly going to be a case of, they were absolutely battering Sheffield United 5-0 at halftime, so why bother? In terms of Watkins, though, I do think the interesting thing too is if we pursue a free at 29 strategy, some people might even be considering selling Watkins this week. And I know it feels like it's jumping ahead of the curve, but it's still a Tottenham fixture. Yes, of course, Tottenham's defense is poor, but if you do want to jump off of Watkins, now could be the time to do so, just so you'd actually allow yourself to maybe move into a Salah plus Haaland structure. Although I myself still think that Watkins is so strong and Haaland's fixtures aren't good enough, really 30 plus, to actually call for sort of taking Watkins out early. If anything, I think it would make more sense to, pivot out of Watkins later, go out of Haaland now, and then actually go back into Haaland later, pivot out of Watkins. So that's sort of my thoughts in terms of Watkins and Haaland and what people have planned in store for them. Obviously, what my team desperately needs when we talk about transfers is someone named Dominic Solanke. But the question, of course, is going to be how I go towards Dominic Solanke as well. In my opinion, I think, as I said, I've got a free at 29 strategy or a free at 34 strategy. Let's go through the free at 29 strategy first. Why would I pursue potentially free at 29 even though I plan for free at 34? I think the first thing to mention is that if we look at, for example, the fixture predictions from Ben Krellin, from Planet FPL, James as well, it is quite clear that Game Week 34 seems to be a rather small game week. So, of course, there's going to be a pretty good potential that we can circumvent Game Week 34 by actually building, for example, for a stronger Game Week 37 team and ignoring 34 a little bit. Obviously, we would lose when it comes to the free hit towards, for example, the rest of the field who are going to free on 34. We're going to lose some points. But the same can be said, of course, even with my team when it comes to the amount of points that I would technically lose heading towards Game Week 29, where people will be, of course, with an extremely strong backline compared to me, potentially one more attacker as well. But that, of course, has some value, right? Because there's going to be hits that I need to take to pursue a free at 34 strategy. So that's the sort of point of comparison as well. Another thing, too, of course, is how big is your gulf going to be in Game Week 34? Because if you're saying that it's a good double game week, and we're expecting, for example, a United double, a Newcastle double, how good are those assets going to be necessarily? It's hard to say because, of course, we have a lot of good single game week playing teams in that week. If Liverpool, let's say, only play a single, they're going to continue to be an extremely strong team that you can have as a single game week keeping team, potentially City as well. And of course, once again, depending on Arsenal, we're probably all going to have triple Arsenal anyway. So I don't think at any point in the season outside of Game Week 29, triple Arsenal is just not going to be anything that's contentious, right? It just really comes down to whether your players haul from Arsenal or not. And with Palmer, of course, I think he's once again a lock where a lot of people are either going to bring him back on Game Week 30. So once again, he doesn't really change the plans. So when it comes to free at 29, though, the question, of course, is now with the Neto injury, if you kind of see, I can't field Neto next week. So that's basically one player out. I have to field Doughty, Saliba, and Gabriel. And Powell, of course, is just some sort of security on the bench, but he has a terrible fixture when it comes to the defensive point of view versus Spurs. And if we look at, for example, my team, Tony has the worst fixture on paper because he's got Arsenal away from home. So looking at this now, it's very clear that I can't field a proper 3-4-3. So what I would need to do for one free transfer to rectify this team is make a very simple move. It's just Tony towards Solanke for one transfer here. So by going Tony to Solanke, I am effectively locking in free at 29 because I'm taking away one of the best players in Gameweek 29 in Tony. And that sort of is almost a statement of me sort of thinking that Tony's not going to live up to my expectations. And that might be the case, right? We've talked about how Tony has some declining stats, but of course it's extremely small sample size. And it's a question, of course, of whether we believe that this Brentford team can make that step up and can also dominate the next few fixtures, which should be a little bit easier as well. Because when we talk about these Brentford fixtures, one of the positives that we can say about this Brentford fixture is that the run is really, really good after Gameweek 29. So if we actually look back at Tony and quickly look at his fixtures here, we're talking about fixtures like Burnley away, Man United at home, Brighton at home. These are still teams that are very, very poor from the defensive point of view. So I think that it's actually quite nice to get the chance to have United players, to get the chance to have to get to have the chance to play versus United and Brighton, teams that still look rather weak defensively. You can see, for example, the performance versus Fulham. This Brighton team has been sort of run ragged. Of course, you're still dealing with the Aston Villa away game, but I think Tony can also give us some really good value here with 33, 34, 35, and 36. 34, of course, we kind of ignore because we're going to have him out of the team with it potentially a free at 34 direction. But of course, if I go 3 at 29, I mean, that's why we don't go Tony, right? Because we suddenly ignore the Burnley game and suddenly the fixtures don't look so good. Although Tony could also come back to the team if we were pursuing a free at 29 strategy, if we were sort of yo-yoing around and then we wanted Tony back in the team around Gameweek 33. So that's something to think about too, whether we actually go for Tony at all, whether he's actually worth keeping. Because the question, of course, is whether I keep Tony for the rest of the season. And it might be the case that I just bin Tony off at Gameweek 35 when he's away versus Everton, which isn't necessarily a great game. So that's another opportunity there. And of course, if I go for Solanke, what I would do after this is, of course, unfortunately with the free hit in Gameweek 29, you're not allowed to save transfers. So on Gameweek 30, I would have to revisit this team, which I think would be a lot weaker than some of the people who have been preparing the single move from Haaland to Salah. And that would be what I would be doing on a free at 34 direction. But on this sort of team here, I mean, what would I be doing for free at 30 or Gameweek 30 rather? What I would be doing, in my opinion, is to just keep the Watkins, Solanke, Haaland structure. I'd probably actually transfer Neto out if I could. Now, the question, of course, is who can I transfer Neto out for? Now, clearly, I've got price and I've got value for Foden, but the question, of course, is are Foden's fixtures good? And the reality is that Gameweeks 30 and 31 are particularly bad for City. So it's Arsenal and Villa, and it's very hard to sort of see Foden being that good of a pick. Now, of course, Foden has been amazing. He's completely destroyed me lately, and fair play to Foden owners. But it's hard to also justify a Foden move there. So I think, once again, the move might potentially be still to go for potentially a Spurs player, someone like Maddison, who still has a really good fixture on 30, a really good fixture on 31, and even 32. So that sort of 3-window run is interesting, but it's also tough to foresee myself seeing actually going for Maddison. It also depends on how the fixtures fall in terms of Gameweek 34. Because one thing that's nice about Gameweek 30 is we will get more information about the doubles in Gameweek 34. And if I choose to free it on 29, I would know who's going to double Gameweek in 34. I would also know who's going to double Gameweek in 37. And I can actually plan adequately as to what that transfer might be. It might still be Foden at the end of the day. And it's kind of nice, of course, that I have enough money to go for Foden. So that's something that's still on my radar, right? That Neto spot can easily be another really good midfielder within the game. And if I'm blocked from Salah, of course, we have some other options. Even on Gameweek 31, for example, the idea of going from Watkins to Darwin as soon as Watkins' fixtures get worse make a lot of sense to me too on this sort of structure. So I can maybe go on back-to-back weeks, Foden and Darwin, and suddenly this team actually looks like a proper FPL team for once, and should hopefully do me good in terms of coming back into getting green arrows and getting points. So that could be quite interesting if I was pursuing a free at 29 strategy. Another alternative, of course, is that I take that immediate hit on Gameweek 30 for Salah. And the way I would do it, of course, is just by taking Haaland out, going straight towards Salah, taking that hit, acknowledging that I should take a hit there, and then, of course, replacing Salah, or rather that Neto and Haaland spot with Salah and Darwin. That could be really exciting. But the question, of course, is what do I do with Gameweek 31 with someone like Watkins? Potentially, of course, Isaac is on the mind of a lot of free at 29 players. You have a really good fixture, which in my opinion is still, for example, that West Ham game, which you do miss. So you could, of course, go for Isaac as well on Gameweek 30. It's either Isaac or Darwin, in my opinion. But I could very well go for the two of them. Next week, for example, particularly if, let's say, Newcastle are giving 34 locked in, it could make sense to go for Darwin and Isaac in back-to-back weeks and sort of replace them. Now, Solanke's an interesting one as well, because I think actually the fixtures are amazing after game week 29, or rather 28, and you still have Everton at home, Crystal Palace at home, Luton away. These are still fantastic fixtures. Even United at home. We saw them absolutely batter United, and United are a bottom half defense. So the only time I really have to consider selling Solanke, or anyone really has to consider selling Solanke, is around game week 34. And that's quite nice, right? In terms of a general transfer direction. Of course, the defense would need some work. We probably need to actually start to slowly bring in some city defenders as well. But I think that would be interesting. But that would be sort of relying on more solid captaincies on 30 and 31, even 32, potentially even 33. Whereas, of course, Haaland does compete very well. He has some nice fixtures on 31 and 33, and technically, right? Because I would say a home fixture is always very nice. Crystal Palace, we still tend to look at them as a pretty good defense. We'll see, of course, how they maintain under the new manager. But of course, that Luton at home fixture would be something that we miss. And potentially an edge that some of the wildcard 31 players would have is that they would actually get a Haaland and Salah structure in place. What's interesting too on Game Week 33 is that you can also see it as an opportunity to move out a Son. So let's say you roll on Game Week 31. On 32, you'd probably, or rather, you make a transfer on 31, you replace Watkins. On Game Week 32, you could potentially roll as well. And you could actually plan for something like, Garnacho coming in, and then also bringing in Haaland within another player as well. And of course, it's probably going to be Solanke at this point, but I can't afford it within the structure. Presumably, of course, if I go for Isaac, I would have enough money to actually upgrade, for example. If I just quickly show some moves like this, like if I go for Isaac here, I would definitely be able to go back into Haaland, no matter what his price is. So that's another opportunity as well. I think we need to think about when the double game week fixtures will fall in 34, and if I pursue a free at 29 strategy, what can I actually do with some of these United players? What can I do with some of these City players, and how do I get towards Haaland and Salah? And on game week 33, that might be the best opportunity to do so, just because Spurs don't actually have good fixtures 33 and onwards, but of course they have a good chance of actually ending the season with amazing fixtures, particularly with a game week 37 double. So that's one thing to think about. So that's the 3 at 29 strategy. And what's convenient about this, of course, is that we know the value of free at 29 now. If I was to create, for example, a draft free at 29, if we were just to make, for example, the team right now, I think what I would be going with is actually probably Doughty, actually. Maybe I think definitely Reguilon, and then Pedro Porro. And then if I had in the midfield right here, I'd have Madison probably, because we heard some news about Richarlison actually being back at the Brazilian camp. I don't know exactly what's going on there. I think maybe he's being a little bit optimistic, but we'll see what happens. But Bowen, of course, would land himself on the free hit. Potentially a Nottingham Forest midfielder would land himself on the free hit. Maybe someone like Alanga, maybe someone like Hudson-Odoi, maybe someone like Gibbs-White. Of course, I mean, it really comes down to your personal preference. So you got two wingers there versus, of course, your prototypical centre mid who's also an attacking center mid who could also get himself onto penalties, which he's obviously got access to. So, and then I'd probably say actually a midfield four makes sense, because we probably actually want to prioritize a front three of Morris, Watkins, and Tony. And this really could be the free at 29 template, right? Fleck and Reguilon, just because I actually think when we talk about the Game Week 29 fixtures, who has actually got the best chance of keeping a clean sheet? It's actually Brentford when it comes down to clean sheet numbers. Now, of course, you might not trust the Brentford defense, but at the same time, have Aston Villa defense been performing recently? Maybe you actually want to go with Areola, just because he's actually someone who seems like he still makes a lot of great saves each match, and you can go for Areola like so. And I think this could be quite interesting, because if you expect, for example, this Aston Villa team to bombard West Ham, you're still going for the keeper who you technically want to have, or would have the best chance of making saves. So it would be Areola, Reguilon, Pedro Porro, and Doughty, just because Doughty, of course, is one of the more attacking fullbacks in the game, and I actually quite like it in a week where not many people are expecting clean sheets. Go for the attacking player. In the midfield, of course, we go for Alanga, Bowen, Son, and Madison, and then Watkins, Tony, Morris. Now, of course, a lot of people will be asking about Douglas Luiz, but I also think that fixture away from home versus West Ham, is it that good? Potentially not. And I think I'd rather, of course, that Nottingham Forest fixture as well, because you're also targeting that really, really poor Luton defense. And this might be the free at 29 draft. And ultimately, I think I'm probably 15 points potentially away from it if I was to pursue a free at 34 direction. So what would I be doing if I pursued a free hit 34? If I was to pursue a free at 34, I think what I would be doing is simply, obviously, I think I kind of have to line my bet, right? Once again, I'll be fielding Gabriel, Saliba, and Doughty. I don't think I'll take that -4 for a Zabarni. I'll keep Pau at the back of my bench, of course. The midfield, of course, needs work. And of course, the way I'll sort of rectify this is by taking a hit for Bowen, and also taking, part of that hit for taking Haaland out. And the reason why, of course, we take Haaland out is because in my opinion, Haaland is quite similar to Bowen in terms of the fixtures in Gameweek 28, right? Bowen versus Burnley at home is quite comparable to Haaland versus Liverpool away. And not to mention, of course, we're bringing in Solanke. So we can sort of justify the value in that sense. We're sort of replacing Haaland with someone a lot cheaper, which allows us to go for Solanke. But then also we actually have Tony and we can keep him for technically his best fixture run, right? Which is the Burnley game, the Man United game, the Brighton game. And of course, you kind of deal with the Aston Villa game, but you actually would like to keep Tony in general. The question, of course, is whether Tony is that valuable, or even whether someone like Bowen is that valuable. Because if we look at West Ham's fixtures, for example, actually they continue to face some pretty weak defenses, right? Outside of the Aston Villa game, you're talking about Newcastle, Spurs, Wolves, Fulham, Crystal Palace. These are very, very good games on paper for Bowen. However, I also think that Bowen is most likely going to be my future Salah replacement. So the question is going to be whether Bowen on Gameweeks 28 and 29 is actually worth it for me and worth that sort of hit. Potentially it is, and I'll sort of explain my transfers. So on Gameweek 28, I'll be fielding this team effectively, which is obviously if I kind of hide out, once again, Flecken, Senesi, and Powell, these players won't feature. I'll be fielding effectively a 3-5-2 here. Once again, Tony won't feature because he just has a horrific game versus Arsenal. Am I expecting anything from Brentford versus Arsenal? Honestly, no. So that's why we're going to field out this team. And this is a very good team, right? Provided that I'm taking a hit. And of course, Haaland could still hurt me versus Liverpool away because I don't see that many people selling Haaland off. Although I think it could be worth the risk for me because on the flip side, as I sort of explained with my previous moves, if I was to, let's say, pursue a non-Salah strategy, I have to take a Salah hit anyways on Gameweek 30 if I was to pursue a free hit 29 strategy. Whereas with this strategy here, because we've already taken Haaland out, we'd be keeping these players. And then on Gameweek 29, of course, we just make another hit once again. And I think it's perfectly justifiable because you have to understand that I won't be able to field out effectively all of these players. And I will not have Solanke either, and I will not have Neto. So I'm looking at a team like this now. If I was to, let's say, take this hit for Bowen, and I think the hits that would make the most sense for my team would be to go for Pedro Porro from Senesi. So if I just sort of fix Gabriel and Saliba in place, and I just remove Fernandes, but keep Palmer and Saka, and then I actually go for Maddison here, assuming that Richarlison's not fit and ready to play in Game Week 29. This would be sort of the team structure that I have, although, of course, I would have gone for Solanke as well. So in 2 weeks' time, I suppose, on Game Week 29, I would take a hit for Maddison and Porro. And, of course, the team actually looks quite good. We've got a backline 3, almost a backline 4. We have three out of 4 of the free hit players, and then we also have 2 out of 3 of the sort of free hit attack as well. So 2 out of 3 of the attack, 3 out of 4 of the midfield. It's not the worst thing in the world. Of course, 1 hit is being taken. So that's, of course, going to be the value lost. Now, I actually think this covers out free hit 29 quite well. I think I'll compete versus a lot of the free hit 29 picks perfectly. Not many people are going to go for that Nottingham Forest midfielder. So the bet I'm actually taking from an effective ownership point of view is actually just going to be against players like Douglas Luiz and potentially Morris, who I still think will be relatively low owned. So in theory, these are going to be the picks that I'm competing with. And I can only get there by taking 2 hits over the next 2 weeks, which also might justify, for example, the upside that I could get on Game Week 34. But of course, Game Week 34, as I said, is not necessarily set in stone. So with the amount of money I have in the bank now, the question mark, of course, is on Game Week 30. What do I do? Game Week 30 is such a good fixture for a team like Spurs. To me, it makes no sense to take Maddison out of my team. And so once again, I have to revisit the idea of actually just selling Bowen and then just going immediately for Salah. Now, what's convenient about this rather on Game Week 30 is that my team on Game Week 30 still looks really good. Of course, I have the Pau fixture. I've got the Pedro Porro fixture, and I can even play Gabriel or I can play Doughty. Now, of course, Doughty just has a ridiculous fixture, so the question is whether I play Gabriel or Saliba. I probably play Gabriel in this fixture just for the attacking upside. We now have Gabriel, we now have Porro, and we now have Pau. So that's 3 really good defenders. In the midfield 5, I think that's amazing. So actually, in my opinion, this Game Week 30 sort of version of the free at 34 strategy is much stronger than what I was sort of debuting with the 3 at 29 strategy. And that's where you can kind of see the flip side, right? Even though I'm taking hits over the next 2 weeks, can I potentially recover and gain potentially from that Salah captaincy on Game Week 30? And this could be quite interesting because this would be my Game Week 30 team on that 3 at 34 template. And then moving on, even though I don't actually have access to Haaland, what I can do, of course, is whenever those City fixtures actually get worse, instead of actually going for Haaland, what I would probably be doing is actually maybe moving Madison on or moving Son on for Foden, and then actually spending some of my other forward transfers on the players that I talked about. Players like Darwin, players like Isaac, who I don't think would make too much sense if, of course, the double lands in Game Week 34, because I'm just free hitting there. I can probably skip Isaac on the contrary and maybe go for someone like Darwin in the meantime, maybe go for another sort of City pick in terms of the defense as well to sort of build up my defense once again. And as I said, go for players like Foden in the short term. And that, of course, could be a nice little way to go for a Salah draft. And then maybe on Game Week 33, I can once again reconsider the idea of bringing Haaland back into the team, through a Spurs midfielder as well. Whoever I don't, let's say, transfer out, if on Game Week 31, I want to transfer one of them out if I really do. Although, of course, Spurs actually have really good fixtures from 30 to 33, so probably no need to do so. So this is another option too. I guess it comes down to really whether I think that there's going to be value with the hits that I'm going to take in the next 2 weeks, and having some comfort that I'm once again gambling a little bit, right? I don't think that it's a gamble to go for Salah in Game Week 30. I think he should be fit. He should be fine then. We also know that there's an international break, so that's more than enough time for Salah to rest and to hopefully start versus Brighton. And he would be a great captaincy option there. And then actually it's the question, of course, of whether Game Week 34 is going to beat that Game Week 29 free hit. And it's hard to justify that. But another thing to think about with Game Week 34 free hit is that ultimately we know that the Game Week 34 fixtures are going to be quite different from Game Week 37 fixtures. So the logical idea of planning for transfers is going to be a little bit more tougher if I was to pursue a Game Week 29 free hit strategy, because of course I would have to sort of make sure that my transfers both attack 34 and 37, which would sort of be contrasting transfers. Whereas if I was to pursue a Game Week 34 free hit strategy, I can basically plan all of my transfers after Game Week 30 when I have full information of Game Weeks 34 and 37 to sort of make sure that I'm accommodated for the strongest bench boost possible in Game Week 37 and ultimately reach Game Week 37 with a stronger bench boost than I would have if I was to pursue free at 29. So I think the question, of course, that I need to pursue is whether I want the short-term gains of, reducing the amount of hits, getting the value of out of free at 29, or, continuing with some of my players, continue with the strategy that I initially picked in terms of Game Week 34 free hit, and basically waiting for Game Week 34 free hit to come around and to hopefully get my gain against the rest of the field. And of course, hopefully a stronger Game Week 37 bench boost. Now, we've seen, of course, how much injuries can ravage a team, but I think this applies to anyone who's wildcarding ever, right? The reality is I've had 4 injuries in the last 2 weeks. Anyone who wildcards from Game Week 35 or Game Week 36 could still suffer some ridiculous injuries on Game Week 37. And so I think when we look at, for example, how bad, quote unquote, a wildcard can be for Game Week 37, if you're planning for a bench boost that far out, I don't think it's actually that big of a deal that, we're planning for a bench boost that far out. The reality, of course, is that the size of that double is huge. Whenever you look at double game weeks this season, the points are just higher. That's the reality of planning for double game weeks and the reality of having double fixtures. So I still think 37 bench boost is the play. Game Week 28 bench boost is definitely not something I'm planning for. Unfortunately, I'm also ravaged by injuries, and that's pretty much where my thoughts are right now. So it's either short-term gains for free at 29, or whether I think that I can actually realistically recuperate from some of the short-term losses that I'll be taking over the next 2 weeks to benefit from free at 34. So that's where my transfer plans are. This is a bit of a lengthier video, but I think it's nice sort of explaining the landscape to some managers who are still stuck between 2 different directions, and also even thinking about conceptualizing how strong is free at 29, and how close we can run towards free at 29 whilst taking maybe some transfers in some hits and transfers in the short term, and to see whether we can come out better in Game Week 34. Of course, I'll be updating a chip strategy video as well in terms of the options that we have right now, and also the sort of different strategies, and also the understanding of Game Week 34 and 37 fixtures. So do look out for that later this week. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and good luck and goodbye.